Now we will move on to talking about the cognitive declines, which personally I think is probably the thing that scares me the most. I don't like the idea of like not being able to think straight or function mentally. So I kind of mentioned this at the beginning, but there's some pretty conflicting findings when it comes to development of cognition across the lifespan. And again, it really comes down to, are we looking at a longitudinal study or a cross-sectional study? And so this is just one example of a graph comparing a cross-sectional study that was looking at verbal ability. And so again, keep in mind, like the 25-year-olds in this study are different from the 32 and 39, et cetera, year-olds. Whereas in the longitudinal study, that's the yellow line. So that would be, someone who's 25, and then you give them the same test at 32, et cetera. And what this shows is that when you look at that cross-sectional research, it looks like there's this really steep, drastic decline in verbal ability as you age. But when you look at the longitudinal study, you don't see that. In fact, you see that verbal ability gets better from about 30 to 50, and then it's pretty level, and then it declines just a little bit, kind of back to its original ability that you had in your 20s. And so again, this would suggest that probably this sharp decline isn't really due to aging, it's due to generational differences. The 25-year-olds in this study probably have much better health outcomes, they probably have higher levels of education than the 88-year-olds in this study did. And so as you're looking forward to kind of your cognitive development, you maybe don't have to be quite as terrified as you otherwise would be if you're looking at just this purple line. There are also differences depending on the type of ability that you're talking about. So this graph was specifically looking at verbal ability. There's different types of cognitive abilities, obviously. Intelligence is sometimes broken down into two broad categories. There's crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence. Crystallized intelligence is essentially like this accumulation of knowledge that you build over time. It comes with experience, and it contributes to your ability to have good judgment and to master kind of social conventions. So these would be things like your vocabulary, your knowledge of history, your ability to tell a story, for example, verbal comprehension, general information, logical reasoning. Those are all examples of crystallized intelligence. And this has been shown to peak in midlife and then decline in the 80s. So it stays very stable throughout this middle adulthood period and doesn't start to decline until you're very elderly in your 80s. This does vary by culture. So cultures that really value like elderly people who have extreme wisdom and who look up to their elderly as a source of that, the elderly people in those cultures tend to have even more stable crystallized intelligence compared to cultures that don't place as much emphasis on that kind of elderly wisdom. So crystallized intelligence stays pretty stable, maybe even increases. Fluid intelligence is essentially your ability to work in the moment with information that's changing quickly. So it involves speed of processing, it involves more working memory. So something like playing a video game, for example, where you have things moving around a lot, you have to quickly react to what's happening. That would be more of a measure of fluid intelligence. Actual tests that measure fluid intelligence are things like spatial visualization, so trying to imagine rotating different objects, things like that. Digit span, which is your ability to hold numbers in mind, like how many numbers can you hold in mind at once. Letter number sequencing, kind of similar to digit span, and also symbol search, so like visually scanning a large display of items and trying to find one that's similar to all the others but slightly different. Those are all ways that fluid intelligence is measured as far as like an intelligence test. This graph over here, kind of messy. All the lines except the purple one are basically showing different types of crystallized intelligence, and basically these stay pretty stable up until, like I said, about the 80s, where you start to have really gradual declines. This one purple line that's kind of buried among all the others is fluid intelligence. In this case, it was perceptual speed, and you can see that that one has this more sort of linear decline from 25 to 80. And so you have this progressive fall off of fluid intelligence that begins in mid-20s, and then you have pretty gradual declines over the lifespan. So again, kind of summarize, crystallized intelligence seems to stay pretty stable until the 80s and then decline gradually, whereas fluid intelligence is the one that does actually decline pretty drastically from 20s going forward. The changes in particularly fluid intelligence may just be due to general slowing of the central nervous system overall. We'll talk about it more in a minute, but you have actual physical changes to the brain that cause that slowing. These midlife declines may not affect well-practiced performances, so things that someone has high expertise in, depending on their career or what their major was in college, you may not have quite as drastic declines in those really well-practiced areas. In addition to just the general slowing of the nervous system, elderly people may also shift to activities that depend less on that cognitive efficiency or that processing speed, the things like fluid intelligence, and more on accumulated knowledge. So basically what happens is, as you start to have small declines in fluid intelligence, you may notice those declines and think, oh, I'm not really good at these things anymore, so I'm going to stop doing them and do things that are more in line with that crystallized intelligence. And as you move away from those activities that use the fluid intelligence, then you're not practicing those skills, and so then you start to have sort of compounding declines where it sort of cyclically gets worse and worse. So it's been shown if you continue to practice skills that use fluid intelligence, then you don't have as sharp of a decline compared to those who kind of abandon those activities. Like I said, this may be due to an overall slowing of the cognitive system as a whole. So we've talked a little bit about how some of your neurons are coated in myelin, that fatty substance that helps like speed up the connections in your brain. And we talked about how as you're aging in childhood, you're building up that myelin. In adulthood, that myelin starts to be broken down. And so as the myelin's broken down, you have a slowdown of those connections. You also have just deteriorating neural connections overall, so not just the myelin itself, but the actual connections between neurons starts to die. And so that slows down processing, and again, that seems to kind of compound throughout the thinking process, or throughout the cognitive system. So, every time we perceive something or we have a thought, it happens in kind of steps within our brain, and the idea is that at each step, you have more and more slowdown within the system. And so that means you have to have more time spent sort of focusing on something in order to interpret it and understand it. This also contributes to declines in executive function, particularly in working memory abilities. So you have declines in working memory, like I said. Your spatial working memory tends to suffer more than verbal working memory. So verbal working memory stays more stable, whereas spatial working memory declines pretty rapidly. Elderly people tend to have reduced inhibition, which is one of the functions of executive function. And so inhibition is basically your ability to sort of focus on the task at hand and inhibit irrelevant stimuli or things that you shouldn't be paying attention to. This is really evident on certain tasks that are called continuous performance tasks. So an example of one of these would be like if you are sitting in front of a computer, there's letters flashed at you one at a time, and you're supposed to press a button whenever you see like a K followed by an A. So you have to continually pay attention to the letters and only push the button at a particular sequence. Elderly people tend to push the button incorrectly to like the wrong sequence. So they may see K, and once you see the K, you're kind of anticipating, okay, is the A coming? If you have good executive function, then you can inhibit that response until you see the A. But someone who's elderly often will not inhibit, and so they'll push it pretty much anytime they see a K. And that's just one measure of this lack of inhibition. Because they have that lack of inhibition, their working memory essentially gets cluttered with all this irrelevant information. So when you have healthy working memory, you can focus on what you're supposed to focus on and inhibit all this irrelevant stuff that may be distracting. But if you can't do that, then all the distracting information is going to kind of get into the working memory. And so that can cause older adults to appear distractible, and it may explain some of like the behaviors that we stereotypically associate with older adults. So, a lot of older adults may say things that seem inappropriate that a younger adult wouldn't normally say. That may be because they can't inhibit that impulse to say something. Also, older adults are kind of stereotyped as sometimes having these like long meandering stories that don't have necessarily like a thread between them. Where they go from one subject to the other. Maybe they're telling a story about being at the grocery store, and then all of a sudden they're talking about their niece or nephew, and it just kind of rambles all over the place. Again, that may be because they can't inhibit all of those thoughts that are popping into their head that aren't relevant to the actual story. They also have more difficulty shifting attention between multiple tasks, so multitasking becomes really difficult. They can, however, compensate through experience, training, and practice. So for example, it's been shown that air traffic controllers, so people who have to like sit and monitor all the different airplanes that are going in different directions, make sure they don't crash into each other, that task requires a heavy load on working memory, lots of multitasking. People who have that as an occupation tend to have slower and less declines in their executive function compared to people in other occupations. So that suggests that it's something you can train and kind of continually practice and prevent those declines from happening.